The sound comes first. It rises from somewhere near the water, a cry so raw it seems to tear itself free from the darkness. At first, you might mistake it for wind moving through the trees, or perhaps some animal calling in the night, but then the words take shape, and the mistake becomes impossible. Ay, mis hijos. The Spanish lands heavy in the air. Oh, my children. A mother's voice, stretched thin by grief, searching for something that was lost long ago and will never be found again. Along rivers and irrigation ditches, near lakes and canals, from the mountains of central Mexico to the deserts of the American Southwest, people have heard this cry for 500 years. Parents use it to keep their children from wandering too close to the water after dark, whispering that the weeping woman might mistake them for her own and drag them beneath the surface. Travelers crossing lonely bridges at night quicken their pace when they hear weeping carried on the breeze, because everyone knows what it means to encounter her. She is La Llorona, the weeping woman, and she has been searching for her children since before anyone alive today was born. But who was she before she became a ghost? What happened at the water's edge that condemned her to walk the riverbanks forever, crying for children she herself destroyed? And how did a single tragedy become one of the most enduring legends in the Americas? Her story begins with a woman named Maria. The story, as most people know it, begins with a woman named Maria. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made strangers stop in the street just to watch her pass. Dark hair that fell past her shoulders, eyes that seemed to hold secrets, skin the color of honey in afternoon light. Maria lived in a small village, and though her family had little wealth, her beauty drew the attention of a man who had plenty. He was a traveler, or perhaps a wealthy ranchero, depending on who tells the story. He wore fine clothes and rode a fine horse, and when he first saw Maria walking through the market, he decided she would be his wife. He pursued her with the relentless charm of a man who had never been refused, and Maria, flattered by his attention and seduced by the promise of a better life, eventually surrendered to his affections. They married, or something close to it, and for a time, Maria believed she had found happiness. She bore him children, usually 2 in most versions of the tale, sometimes 3, and she loved them with the fierce devotion of a mother who sees her own future reflected in her children's eyes. Her husband provided for them, built them a home, and for those early years the family seemed blessed. But the man who had once pursued Maria so passionately began to lose interest, the way men sometimes do when the thrill of conquest fades into the routine of domestic life. His visits grew less frequent, his affection more distant, and whispers reached Maria that he had taken another woman, someone of higher birth, someone more suited to the life he truly wanted. Then came the river. Some versions say Maria confronted her husband and he rejected her openly, telling her she was nothing more than a peasant girl he had grown tired of, that she and her children were obstacles to the future he now desired. Others say she never confronted him at all, that the humiliation festered in silence until it curdled into something unrecognizable. But in every version, the outcome is the same. Maria took her children to the river. She led them down to the water's edge as twilight settled over the valley, and in a moment of madness, grief, or rage so total it eclipsed everything else, she drowned them. Her own children, the ones she had loved, the ones who had trusted her completely, the ones who called her mother. She pushed them beneath the dark water and held them there until they stopped struggling, and when it was done, she finally understood what she had become. The realization destroyed her. Some say she threw herself into the same river immediately afterward, desperate to follow her children into death. Others say she wandered the banks for days, wailing inconsolably, until she collapsed and perished from grief. Still others claim She was never allowed to die at all. That God, or the devil, or some force beyond human understanding, condemned her to walk the earth forever, searching for children she could never find, and mourning a crime she could never undo. This is the woman who became La Llorona. She wanders still, always near water, dressed in the same white gown she wore that terrible evening, her face sometimes beautiful and sometimes skeletal, her voice carrying across the night with that same endless cry. Ay, mis hijos. If you hear her, when her voice sounds distant, they say she is dangerously close. But if her wailing seems near, you may yet escape, because the sound travels strangely in the realm between the living and the dead. And if she mistakes you for one of her lost children, or simply decides to take you in their place, the river will claim another soul. Those who claim to have seen her describe something that shifts between beauty and horror, as if the ghost cannot decide which face to wear. Sometimes she appears as she must have looked in life, a beautiful woman in a flowing white dress, her dark hair cascading past her shoulders, her skin pale in the moonlight. She drifts along the riverbank with a grace that seems almost serene, and from a distance you might mistake her for an ordinary woman out for a late evening walk. But when she turns toward you, the illusion shatters. Her eyes are hollow or weeping blood. Her face is skeletal, the flesh melted away to reveal bone beneath. Her beauty becomes a mask that slips, revealing something ancient and terrible underneath. In other accounts, she has no face at all, just a blank oval of white where features should be, or a swirling darkness that your mind refuses to hold. Some say she floats above the ground, her feet never touching the earth, while others insist she leaves wet footprints on the path, the kind of prints that vanish with the morning sun. Her dress is always white, always wet, clinging to her form as if she has just risen from the water that claimed her children and perhaps herself. And always there is the crying. The legend operates according to its own logic, a set of rules passed down through generations of parents warning their children about the dangers that lurk near water after dark. La Llorona hunts at night, her domain the margins between dry land and flowing water, the rivers and streams, the irrigation ditches and canals, the lakes and reservoirs where children might wander if left unattended. She is drawn to the sound of young voices, perhaps mistaking them for the cries of her own lost children, and she searches without rest, moving from one waterway to the next, never satisfied, never at peace. If she finds a child alone near the water, some versions say she will simply take them, dragging them beneath the surface to join her lost ones in death. Others claim she tries to embrace them as her own, not understanding that her touch is fatal, that her grief is a contagion that spreads to anyone unlucky enough to fall within her grasp. She is a warning made flesh, or rather, made ghost. Stay away from the water. Come home before dark. Do not wander alone. Every rule that parents repeat to keep their children safe finds its embodiment in La Llorona, the consequence waiting in the darkness for those who disobey. Maria's story is powerful because it is simple. Betrayal, madness, infanticide, eternal punishment. But this ghost has older roots. When scholars began to trace La Llorona's origins, they discovered that this ghost story contains layers far older than the colonial-era narrative suggests. Layers that reach back to a time before Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, before the conquest that would reshape an entire hemisphere. To find where La Llorona truly began, we must travel back 500 years, to the city the Aztecs called the center of the world, to a time when priests recorded 8 omens that would foretell their civilization's doom, and to the 6th of those omens, the cry of a woman weeping through the night for her children. In the year 1519, Spanish ships appeared on the eastern horizon of Mexico, bringing with them soldiers, priests, and ambitions that would reshape the world. Within 2 years, the Aztec Empire would fall. Tenochtitlan, the shimmering island capital that awed the Spanish with its canals and temples and population greater than most European cities, would be reduced to rubble. Moctezuma, the emperor who had ruled with the authority of a living god, would be dead, his people conquered by a force that arrived from across the ocean with weapons they had never seen and diseases against which they had no defense. It was a catastrophe beyond comprehension, the death of not just an empire, but an entire way of understanding the world. And according to records compiled after the conquest, it was a catastrophe that had been foretold. In the decades following the conquest, a Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún undertook one of the most ambitious ethnographic projects in history. Sahagún had come to New Spain as a missionary, charged with converting the indigenous population to Christianity, but he possessed a curiosity that extended far beyond religious conversion. He wanted to understand the people he had been sent to save, to document their beliefs and customs and histories before they vanished entirely under the pressure of colonization. And so he spent decades interviewing Nahua elders, men who had lived through the fall of their civilization and who carried in their memories the knowledge of a world that was rapidly disappearing. The result was the Florentine Codex, a 12-volume encyclopedia of Aztec life compiled in both Nahuatl and Spanish, illustrated with hundreds of drawings that preserved everything from religious rituals to medicinal plants to the structure of daily life. It remains one of the most valuable sources of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican culture ever created, a window into a world that the conquest had shattered. And among the many things the elders told Sahagún, recorded faithfully in the Codex's pages, were the omens. There were 8 of them, according to the accounts collected in the 1550s, 8 signs that preceded the arrival of the Spanish and foretold the destruction to come. The first was a column of fire that appeared in the night sky for a full year, blazing like a wound in the heavens. The elders who spoke to Sahagún described it in vivid detail. It rose in the east at midnight, a pillar of flame that stretched from the horizon to the very zenith of the sky, so bright it turned night into day. The people of Tenochtitlan woke each night to its light, and each night they wept and cried out in fear, striking their mouths in the traditional gesture of mourning. They knew something terrible was coming. The second omen struck closer to home. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the patron deity of the Aztec people, spontaneously burst into flames. The fire seemed to erupt from within the structure itself, and when priests and slaves rushed to extinguish it with water, the flames only grew stronger, devouring the sacred building as if the water were fuel. Some said the god himself had abandoned his people. The third omen struck without warning, lightning from a cloudless sky. The temple of Xiuhtecutli, the fire god, stood serenely one moment and was smashed by a thunderbolt the next, though not a single cloud darkened the heavens above. The people said it was a blow struck by the sun itself, a punishment from the gods for sins they could not name. The fourth omen came in daylight, a comet that blazed across the sky in 3 parts, streaming fire that seemed to scatter sparks like embers thrown from a great brazier. The fifth omen was water that boiled without fire. The great lake surrounding Tenochtitlan suddenly began to rise, churning and foaming as if heated by invisible flames beneath, flooding parts of the city and destroying homes near the shore. The seventh omen was stranger still. Hunters captured a bird like a crane, ashen-colored and bearing a strange mirror on its head. When Moctezuma looked into this mirror, he saw the stars, though it was midday. When he looked again, he saw armed men mounted on animals like deer, warriors of a type he had never seen. Before he could summon his priests to interpret the vision, the bird vanished. The eighth and final omen spoke of monsters, two-headed creatures that appeared in the streets and were brought before the emperor, only to vanish the moment he beheld them. But it is the sixth omen that concerns us here. Many times, the elders told Sahagun, a woman would be heard going along weeping and shouting. She cried out loudly at night, her voice carrying through the streets of Tenochtitlan and across the waters of the Great Lake, saying words that no one could hear without feeling a cold dread settle into their bones. The exact phrase, as recorded in the Florentine Codex, was this: "O my children, we are about to go forever." And sometimes, the elder said, she would cry, "O my children, where am I to take you?" Here, 500 years before the legend of Maria and her drowned children would take its familiar form, was a woman wailing through the night for children who would be lost, a supernatural figure dressed in white, appearing in the darkness to prophesy doom. The account dates to approximately 1509, a full decade before Hernán Cortés would set foot on Mexican soil, and yet the parallels to La Llorona are unmistakable. The nocturnal appearance, the white clothing, the anguished cries for children, the sense that her wailing portends something terrible. The Aztecs who heard her understood the cry as an omen of what was coming, a warning that their children, their way of life, their entire civilization was about to be swept away. When the Spanish arrived 10 years later and began systematically dismantling everything the Aztec world held sacred, the wailing woman's prophecy would seem terribly, horribly accurate. This was not Maria. The weeping woman of the Aztec Omen had no name, or rather, she had a name that belonged to something far older and more powerful than a wronged wife from a colonial-era village. The Aztecs who heard her understood immediately who she was, because they had been telling stories about her for generations. They called her Cihuacoatl, the Snake Woman. And in the Aztec pantheon, she was one of the most feared and revered goddesses of all, a deity associated with childbirth, with motherhood, and with the terrible things that can happen when those sacred bonds are broken. To understand La Llorona, to truly understand where this legend comes from and why it has endured for half a millennium, we must first understand her. In the Aztec understanding of the world, childbirth was war. When a woman went into labor, she was not merely bringing new life into the world. She was engaged in a battle as real and as dangerous as any fought by warriors on the battlefield. A struggle in which victory meant a healthy child and defeat meant death for mother or infant, or both. The midwives who attended her addressed her as a warrior, urging her on with the same language used to encourage soldiers before combat, praising her courage and her endurance as she fought through the pain. And like warriors, women who died in this battle were honored. They became the Cihuateteo. The Cihuateteo were the spirits of women who had died in childbirth, transformed by their sacrifice into supernatural beings who occupied a terrifying place in Aztec cosmology. They were honored as fallen heroes, their bodies treated with the same reverence accorded to warriors who perished in battle. But they were also deeply feared, because death had changed them into something dangerous. According to Aztec belief, the Cihuateteo descended to earth on certain nights, gathering at crossroads where they waited to steal children from the living. Their faces had become skull-like in death, their beauty transformed into something terrible, and they moved through the darkness with a single consuming purpose: to take children and make them their own, perhaps to replace the ones they had lost in the act of dying. Parents kept their children indoors on the nights when the Cihuateteo were believed to walk. Offerings were left at crossroads to appease them and divert their attention. The very places where paths met became haunted ground, liminal spaces where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin and dangerous. and presiding over these spirits, guiding them and embodying their collective grief and rage, was their goddess. Her name was Cihuacoatl, the snake woman, and she was one of the most powerful and feared deities in the Aztec pantheon. The Florentine Codex describes her in terms that should now sound familiar. She was depicted as a woman dressed in white, often with a skull-like face and eagle feathers adorning her head. She appeared at night, wandering through the streets of Tenochtitlan, and when she appeared, she wailed. Her cries were so terrible, so filled with grief and fury, that those who heard them understood immediately that disaster was coming. She was, as the Codex puts it, a savage beast and an evil omen, and yet she was also something else entirely, a goddess of motherhood and childbirth, a protector of women in labor, a deity who understood better than any other the terrible things that could happen at the boundary between life and death. Cihuacoatl was not simply a ghost. She was the goddess from whom all ghostly weeping women descended, the divine template for the spirits who would haunt rivers and crossroads, and the nightmares of children for centuries to come. And according to the myths, she was intimately connected to the loss of children. Some accounts describe Cihuacoatl as a goddess who stole children from their cradles, snatching them in the night to satisfy some hunger that death and divinity had placed within her. Others emphasize her role as a goddess who lost her own children, or who represented the collective grief of all the women who had died bringing children into the world, only to be separated from them forever. The connection to water appears here as well. Chalchiuhtlicue, the goddess of rivers and lakes, was closely associated with Cihuacoatl in Aztec religion, and the two often appeared together in rituals and iconography. Water was already a liminal space in Aztec thought, a boundary between worlds, and the image of a weeping goddess standing at the water's edge was not an invention of Spanish colonialism, but an ancient belief with roots stretching back centuries before European ships crossed the Atlantic. When the Spanish arrived and the world the Aztecs knew came to an end, Cihuacoatl's wailing took on a new and terrible meaning. The children she wept for were no longer individual victims, but an entire people, an entire civilization destroyed by conquest, disease, and forced conversion. Her cry, "Oh my children, we are about to go forever," no longer sounded like a supernatural warning, but like a historical fact, a lament for a culture that was being systematically erased. The goddess who had haunted crossroads now haunted the ruins of temples. The spirit who had stolen children now mourned the millions who had died in the catastrophe of colonization. And as the centuries passed, and the memory of Cihuacoatl faded among a population now taught to pray to Spanish saints, her image did not disappear. It merged, slowly and invisibly, with the folklore the colonizers brought from Europe, and with the new stories that emerged from the violent mixing of two worlds. The skull-faced goddess became a beautiful woman named Maria. The ancient cry for lost children became the wail of a drowned woman searching the riverbanks. La Llorona had begun her transformation. There is another woman whose story has become entangled with La Llorona, a historical figure rather than a legend, whose life has been reinterpreted so many times that she exists somewhere between fact and myth. Her original name was Malintzin, though the Spanish called her Doi plus a Marina, and history remembers her most commonly as La Malinche. She was born into a noble Nahua family sometime around the year 1500, and by the time she was a teenager, she had already been sold into slavery, passed between various indigenous groups as a commodity, a girl whose life had been marked by abandonment and displacement from the very beginning. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with his small army of conquistadors, Malintzin was among the slaves presented to him as tribute. She was approximately 19 years old. She spoke both Nahuatl and several Maya dialects, and she would soon prove herself indispensable to the conquest that was about to unfold. She became Cortez's interpreter, his cultural guide, his voice in a world he could not otherwise have navigated. Without Malintzin, the conquest might have unfolded very differently. She translated negotiations with indigenous leaders, explained Aztec customs and political structures to Cortez, and helped him forge the alliances with rival groups that proved essential to defeating the far larger Aztec forces. She was not merely a passive conduit for communication, but an active strategist whose knowledge of both European and Mesoamerican worlds made her uniquely valuable. Cortez relied on her absolutely, and their relationship extended beyond the professional. She became his mistress and bore him a son, a boy named Martin, who would grow up to be one of the first recorded mestizos, a child of two worlds who embodied in his very existence the violent mixing that the conquest had initiated. For this role, history has never quite decided what to make of her. To some, La Malinche is a traitor, the woman who sold out her own people to foreign invaders, who used her linguistic gifts to help destroy the civilization into which she had been born. The term Malinchista survives in Mexican Spanish to this day, a pejorative for anyone who prefers foreign things over their own culture, who betrays their people for personal advancement. From this perspective, she is a villain, a collaborator whose memory deserves condemnation. To others, she is a victim, a woman who had already been enslaved and sold before the Spanish arrived, who had no particular loyalty to the Aztec Empire that had treated her as property, and who used the limited options available to her to survive in circumstances not of her choosing. She was a teenager in a world of violent men, navigating impossible situations with the only tools she possessed, her intelligence and her tongue. From this perspective, she is neither villain nor hero, but a survivor, a woman whose story is far more complicated than any simple judgment can capture. And to still others, she is something even more complex. The mother of a nation, the woman whose union with Cortez symbolically gave birth to modern mestizo Mexico, a figure whose tears and grief represent the foundational trauma of an entire people. It is in this last interpretation that La Malinche merges with La Llorona. After Martin was born, Cortez took the boy from his mother to raise him in Spain according to Spanish customs. Malintzin never saw her son again. This is historical fact. The child was removed from her, sent across an ocean, separated from his mother permanently. And while Malintzin eventually married a Spanish soldier and lived a relatively comfortable life by the standards of the colonial period, dying sometime in the 1520s or 1550s, the image of a mother separated from her child proved irresistible to those who would later weave her story into the fabric of La Llorona. Some versions of the legend explicitly name La Malinche as La Llorona, claiming that she did not merely lose her child, but killed him, drowning Martin in a river to prevent Cortez from taking him, then wandering the waterways forever in guilt and grief. This is almost certainly not true as history, but that hardly matters to legend. What makes the identification so powerful is its symbolic resonance. La Malinche helped destroy her own people. Whether she did so willingly or under compulsion, whether she had any real choice in the matter, or simply did what she had to do to survive, the result was the same. The world she had been born into was swept away, replaced by something new and violent and strange. The grief of La Llorona, in this reading, is not just the grief of an individual mother who lost her children, but the grief of an entire culture that lost its children, its language, its gods, and its way of life to the trauma of conquest. When La Llorona wanders the rivers crying for her lost children, she is not only Maria mourning the babies she drowned, She is also Xihuacoatl, the goddess who wailed through the streets of Tenochtitlan before the Spanish ships appeared. She is also La Malinche, separated from her son and transformed by history into a symbol of her people's destruction. She is every mother who lost a child to disease, to war, to the violent upheaval of colonization, to the forced mixing of blood and belief that created modern Latin America. Her cry echoes across 5 centuries because it carries the weight of all those losses, compressed into a single voice, a single figure, a single phrase repeated endlessly through the night. By the time the colonial period had fully reshaped Mexico, La Llorona had absorbed all these layers. She was a cautionary tale about a woman who killed her children and was punished for it. She was an echo of ancient goddesses who had wailed through the darkness for centuries before European contact. She was a symbol of the traumatic birth of a new nation, forged from the violent mixing of indigenous and Spanish blood. And she was something else as well, something that connected her to stories told across the ocean in lands the Aztecs had never heard of. Because the Weeping Woman was not unique to Mexico. She had sisters in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the misty edges of the Celtic world, all of them crying through the night for children lost and sins unforgivable. And when the Spanish brought their ships and their soldiers and their priests to the Americas, they brought their ghosts as well. The image of a weeping woman who has lost her children is older than Mexico, older than the Spanish conquest, older than the Aztec Empire itself. When Spanish colonizers crossed the Atlantic, they carried with them not only weapons and diseases and religious fervor, but also centuries of European folklore, stories of ghosts and monsters and supernatural punishments that would blend with indigenous beliefs to create something new. And among those stories were tales of weeping mothers that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the legend that would eventually become La Llorona. The ancient Greeks told the story of Lamia, a beautiful queen who became the lover of Zeus and bore him children. When Hera, Zeus's jealous wife, discovered the affair, she murdered Lamia's children as punishment, driving the woman mad with grief until she transformed into something monstrous. Unable to find peace, cursed by the gods to never close her eyes, and thus to forever see the image of her dead offspring, Lamia began to steal and devour the children of other mothers, becoming a bogeyman used to frighten Greek children into obedience for centuries. The parallels to La Llorona are difficult to ignore. A woman beautiful in life, children lost through circumstances beyond her control, madness transforming grief into violence, and an eternal punishment that involves wandering the earth, threatening the children of others. Even closer is the story of Medea, the sorceress from Colchis, who helped Jason steal the Golden Fleece and became his wife. When Jason abandoned Medea for a younger, more politically advantageous bride, she responded with an act of vengeance so extreme it has haunted Western imagination for 2.5 millennia. Euripides staged it in Athens in 431 BCE, in a play that shocked audiences then and continues to disturb audiences now. Medea murdered her own sons to punish the man who had betrayed her, killing the children they had made together so that Jason would have no heirs, no legacy, nothing left of the life they had shared. The play gives us her reasoning in chilling detail. She knows what she is about to do. She knows it is monstrous, and she does it anyway because her rage at being discarded demands satisfaction beyond any ordinary revenge. She sends poisoned gifts to Jason's new bride, killing both the princess and her father, the king. And then, when Jason comes running to salvage what he can, she murders their sons where he can hear their screams, denying him even the chance to say goodbye. Unlike Lamia, whose children were taken from her, Medea made a choice. She was not driven mad by divine punishment, but acted with terrible, lucid purpose, destroying what she loved most to inflict maximum suffering on the man who had wronged her. And in most tellings of her story, she does not wander the earth in grief, but escapes on a divine chariot, pulled by dragons, provided by her grandfather, the sun god Helios. She flies away unpunished and unrepentant, leaving Jason broken on the ground below, surrounded by the bodies of everyone he loved. This is perhaps the crucial difference between Medea and La Llorona. Both killed their children because of a faithless husband. But where Medea is portrayed as fierce and unbroken, La Llorona is condemned to eternal suffering, punished by her own guilt and by forces greater than herself. Medea ascends, La Llorona wanders. One escapes, the other is trapped forever. Further north, in the mists of Ireland and Scotland, lived the Banshee, a female spirit whose wailing foretold death. The Banshee did not kill anyone herself, but her cry was an omen no one wanted to hear, a sound that meant someone in the household would die before dawn. She was sometimes described as a beautiful woman, sometimes as a terrifying hag, often dressed in white or wrapped in a grey cloak, and her grief was bottomless, endless, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the night. The connection to La Llorona centers on the cry itself. Both are wailing women, spirits whose mourning is their defining characteristic, whose voices carry supernatural weight and deadly meaning. And like La Llorona, the Banshee often appears near water, washing shrouds at river crossings before a death occurs. From Germany came similar figures, the Weiße Frau, or White Lady, a ghost in white who haunted castles and gave warnings of coming doom. From Spain itself came local variants, weeping women who wandered the countryside for sins they could never expiate, stories that Spanish soldiers and settlers would have carried in their memories when they crossed the Atlantic to remake a continent. When these European traditions encountered the indigenous beliefs of Mesoamerica, something remarkable happened. The weeping woman archetype, already present in Aztec religion through Cihuacoatl and the Cihuateteo, found reinforcement from these similar European figures. The colonizers and the colonized did not merely clash, they merged, their stories bleeding into one another across generations of intermarriage, forced conversion, and cultural exchange. The result was La Llorona, as she exists today, neither purely indigenous nor purely European, but a fusion of both, a legend that drew from Greek tragedy and Irish folklore and Aztec prophecy, combining them into something new and uniquely American. The legend did not stay in one place. As Spanish colonization spread northward from central Mexico into the territories that would eventually become Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, La Llorona traveled with the settlers, the soldiers, the missionaries, and the families who carved out new lives in unfamiliar landscapes. And in each new place, the legend adapted to its surroundings, absorbing local geography and local fears, attaching itself to specific rivers and canals and ditches, until it became as much a part of the landscape as the mountains on the horizon. The core of the story remained constant: a woman, her lost children, the water where tragedy occurred, the eternal weeping. But the details shifted depending on who told the tale and where they lived, creating a tapestry of regional variations that stretched across thousands of miles. In New Mexico, the oldest continuously inhabited region of what would become the United States, La Llorona found a natural home. The acequias, those ancient irrigation channels that have watered crops in the Rio Grande Valley for centuries, became her domain. Santa Fe residents tell stories of hearing her along the Santa Fe River and the narrow ditches that thread through the old town, her cries mixing with the sound of cottonwood leaves rustling in the autumn wind. In Las Cruces, they named a park after her, La Llorona Park, a place where families picnic during the day, but few care to linger after dark. The legend here often emphasizes her connection to La Malinche and the trauma of the conquest, a version of the story that carries particular weight in a region where Spanish and indigenous histories have been intertwined for more than 400 years. One account from the 1980s describes a family near Santa Fe who heard weeping outside their home late at night. When they investigated, they saw a woman in white walking along an acequia that bordered their property. She seemed to drift rather than walk, her feet invisible in the darkness. And when they called out to ask if she needed help, she turned toward them briefly, then vanished into the night air as if she had never existed at all. In Texas, particularly the regions along the Rio Grande and the countless irrigation canals that bring water to farms and ranches, the legend takes on a threatening edge. Parents invoke La Llorona not merely as a caution, but as an active danger, warning children that she roams the ditches, searching for replacements for her drowned children, and that she will drag any child who lingers too long near the water down to join them. The story of Hollering Woman Creek near San Antonio offers its own origin, one distinctly American in its violence. In this version, the weeping woman was not a betrayed lover, but a pioneer mother on the Texas frontier in the 1840s. When a raiding party attacked her homestead and killed her husband before her eyes, she faced an impossible choice. Let her children be taken, knowing the fate that might await them, or spare them that horror by her own hand. According to legend, she chose the latter, carrying her children to the creek and drowning them rather than letting them be taken alive. Then she screamed, a sound so terrible and so sustained that the attackers fled in terror, believing they had encountered something supernatural. She wandered the creek banks for 3 days afterward, they say, until she finally collapsed and died of grief. And in the years since, travelers along that stretch of water have reported hearing a woman's voice screaming through the night, a sound that carries for miles across the Texas brush country. In El Paso, along the banks of the Rio Grande that marks the border between nations, some versions add a seductive element to the danger. Here, La Llorona does not only hunt children, she also appears to unfaithful men, beautiful and alluring, until she has lured them close enough to reveal her true nature, dragging them into the river to die for sins that mirror her husband's original betrayal. Stories from the border communities describe men who were out late, often returning from places they should not have been, who encountered a beautiful woman crying by the water. Moved by pity or attraction, they approached, only to find that when they drew close enough, her face transformed into something terrible, and the river suddenly seemed to reach up and pull them under. Local police in El Paso have reportedly found bodies in the Rio Grande over the years, men who drowned in stretches of river that were not particularly dangerous, with no obvious explanation for how they ended up in the water. Was it La Llorona? The legend offers an explanation that some find more satisfying than mystery. Arizona's version adapts to the desert landscape, where the canal systems that bring water from distant mountains are simultaneously lifelines and danger zones. In Phoenix and Tucson, with their significant Mexican-American populations, she walks along the Salt River and the Santa Cruz River and the countless irrigation channels that crisscross the metropolitan areas. Families tell their children to stay away from the canals after sunset, when La Llorona might emerge to search for victims in the dark water. One distinctive Arizona detail holds that touching her will cause a burn that never heals, as if grief itself were a kind of fire. Further south, in Guatemala and throughout Central America, the legend took root in different soil but produced recognizable fruit. Here the story often involves a young woman of great beauty who falls in love with a man above her station, bears him a child, and is abandoned when he returns to the respectable life that was always waiting for him. The drowning follows, then the eternal wandering, then the cautionary tales told to children who stay out too late at night. But the Guatemalan version adds a curious detail about her cry. When La Llorona sounds close, they say, she is actually far away. When she sounds distant, she is dangerously near. The normal logic of sound is reversed in her presence, as if the space around her operates according to supernatural rules that the living do not understand. This inversion appears in other Central American and Mexican variations as well, a reminder that encountering La Llorona means entering a realm where ordinary certainties no longer apply. If you hear her weeping nearby and relax because the sound seems far off, you have made a terrible mistake. The ghost follows rules that exist only to trap the unwary. Across all these variations, certain elements remain constant. There is always water, rivers, canals, lakes, ditches, streams. There is always night. There are always children, either the ones she lost or the ones she seeks. And there is always the cry, sometimes written as a scream and sometimes as a wail, but always carrying that same phrase, "Ay, mis hijos," oh my children. The legend endures because water is dangerous and children must be taught to fear it. It endures because the story is simple enough to remember and frightening enough to make an impression. And it endures because underneath all the regional details, there lies a truth about grief that transcends any particular time or place. That there are some losses so profound, they echo forever, turning the one who suffers into something no longer quite human. Every generation of parents faces the same problem. How do you keep children safe from dangers they are too young to understand? Water is one of the oldest of those dangers. Rivers and lakes and canals and ditches have been claiming young lives for as long as humans have lived near them, drawn by curiosity or thirst or the simple joy of play, then pulled under by currents they underestimated or depths they could not escape. You can explain to a child that water is dangerous. You can forbid them from going near it alone. But explanations and prohibitions have limits, especially for children too young to truly understand mortality. What works better is a story. If you tell a child that they might drown, they may or may not take you seriously. But if you tell them that a woman in white walks the riverbanks after dark, searching for children to drag beneath the water, and that her mournful cries can sometimes be heard on quiet nights, and that she will mistake any child she finds for her own lost ones and pull them down to join her in death, now you have something that sticks. La Llorona is a fear delivery system, a way to encode genuine danger in a form that children's minds can hold on to. The ghost is memorable where statistics are not. The image of a weeping woman in white, rising from the mist near the water, is far more effective than a lecture about drowning risks. And so parents across Latin America and the American Southwest have been deploying La Llorona for exactly this purpose for centuries, warning their children that she walks the canals after sunset, that she haunts the acequias when the stars come out, that anyone foolish enough to wander near water after dark might hear her cry and never return home. But the cautionary function extends beyond children. When you examine the structure of the legend, a woman betrayed by a faithless husband, driven to madness by his abandonment, punished eternally for the violence that resulted, you see another set of warnings embedded in the story, warnings aimed at adults as much as children. To men, La Llorona says, "Here is what happens when you betray the women who love you." The consequences of infidelity do not end with a divorce or a broken home. They ripple outward, destroying everything they touch, turning love into grief and grief into violence. The man who abandons his family is responsible for what follows, even if he never witnesses it directly. To women, particularly in traditional societies where options for abandoned wives were severely limited, the legend offers a darker lesson. La Llorona's punishment is eternal because her crime is unforgivable. She killed her own children. No amount of suffering can expiate that sin. No amount of remorse can earn redemption. The message is grim. Do not let yourself become this. No matter how deep your grief or how justified your rage, there are lines that cannot be crossed. Some modern interpreters have pushed back against this reading, finding in La Llorona not a warning, but a kind of resistance. Feminist scholars, particularly within the Chicana tradition, have argued that La Llorona represents the impossible position that patriarchal society forces upon women, expected to sacrifice everything for husband and children, abandoned when she is no longer useful, then blamed and punished when she breaks under the pressure. In this reading, La Llorona is not a cautionary tale about what women should avoid becoming, but a symbol of what society has done to women, a figure whose eternal grief reveals the violence inherent in systems that treat women as property. Her cry is not just grief, but protest. Her wandering is not just punishment, but refusal to disappear. She haunts because she was wronged, and she will keep haunting until the wrong is acknowledged. Whatever interpretation you favor, the legend endures because it speaks to real fears and real social functions. Children must be kept away from water. Families must be held together. Betrayal has consequences. Grief can destroy. And there are some wounds that never heal, some losses that echo through generations, some ghosts that no amount of time can lay to rest. La Llorona persists because she embodies all of this. She is every mother who lost a child. She is every woman who was abandoned. She is every warning rendered in story form, every fear given a white dress and a mournful cry. She is ancient, and she is still walking, and she will continue to walk for as long as people find her useful and true. In the modern era, people still claim to see her. The accounts collected over the past century follow a pattern recognizable across cultures and continents, the structure of a ghost story that may or may not reflect genuine experience. It is late at night, the witness is near water, and something white appears in the darkness. Sometimes the figure walks, sometimes it drifts, sometimes it simply stands there, watching, before vanishing when approached or when the witness looks away. And running through all these accounts, like a thread connecting them to the centuries-old legend, is the sound of a woman crying. The sightings cannot be verified in any scientific sense. There are no photographs that survive scrutiny, no recordings that cannot be explained by other means, no physical evidence that would satisfy a court of law. And yet the testimonies persist, generation after generation, from people who have nothing obvious to gain from claiming an encounter with the supernatural. The Santa Fe encounter from the 1980s is typical of the form. A family living in a house that bordered an acequia heard weeping outside one autumn night, a sound so mournful and sustained that they initially assumed someone was in distress. When they went to check, they saw a woman in a white dress walking along the irrigation ditch, her movements smooth and her feet invisible in the darkness below her gown's hem. They called out to ask if she needed help. She turned toward them, and then, according to their account, she simply ceased to exist, vanishing into the night air as if she had never been there at all. The family was not particularly superstitious. They did not immediately connect what they had seen to La Llorona or any other legend. But when they described the encounter to neighbors, the response was knowing nods and unsurprised faces. Of course she walks the acequia, they were told. She always has. You're not the first to see her, and you won't be the last. Reports cluster around the same kinds of locations, decade after decade. The Rio Grande from New Mexico through Texas receives the most accounts, particularly in areas where the river passes near residential neighborhoods or where old irrigation systems create networks of smaller waterways. The canals of Phoenix and the arroyos of Tucson have their share. So do more obscure locations, remote creeks outside small towns, farm ponds surrounded by nothing but fields and darkness, the concrete-lined flood channels that cut through modern cities like arteries of danger. Some reports describe only sounds, the weeping, the words in Spanish, the sense that something is present even when nothing can be seen. Others describe a visual manifestation that matches the classic descriptions, almost point for point. White dress, dark hair, pale face that may or may not be fully human. A few describe more elaborate encounters, conversations or pursuits, or physical contact that left lasting effects. But these are rarer and harder to evaluate. In Laredo, Texas, along the banks of the Rio Grande, reports have persisted for generations. One account from 1965 describes a Border Patrol agent who was making his nightly rounds when he heard what he believed to be a woman in distress near the river. He followed the sound for nearly a quarter mile, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, until he found himself at the water's edge with no one in sight. The crying continued, seeming to come from the river itself, until suddenly it stopped, and he felt what he later described as a cold hand on his shoulder. When he spun around, there was no one there, but he said the temperature dropped so sharply that he could see his own breath, despite the warm Texas night. The city of Guadalajara, Mexico, has its own famous location, the Plaza de la Consolación in the historic center, where a fountain stands that locals say was built on the site where La Llorona drowned her children centuries ago. Residents of the surrounding buildings have reported seeing a woman in white standing motionless by the fountain late at night, particularly on nights when the wind carries the sound of water splashing in a certain way. One account from 2003 describes a taxi driver who picked up a pale woman in white near the plaza at 3 in the morning. She asked to be taken to the river, but when he arrived at the destination and turned around to collect his fare, the back seat was empty and damp, as if someone wet had been sitting there moments before. Children report encounters with particular frequency, perhaps because the legend is often told to them as a warning, and their minds are primed to perceive what they have been taught to fear. In Las Cruces, New Mexico, a 1997 account describes a 7-year-old girl who told her mother she had been woken by crying outside her window. When the mother looked, she saw nothing, but her daughter insisted a lady in white had been standing in the backyard, staring at her window. The mother dismissed it as a nightmare until her neighbor mentioned the same thing the following morning. His son, who shared a backyard fence with the family, had also reported seeing a woman in white the same night. Skeptics offer explanations. The sounds attributed to La Llorona could be owls, coyotes, or the wind moving through trees in patterns that sound like human speech to primed ears. The visual sightings could be misidentification of ordinary phenomena, the tricks that darkness and expectation play on human perception, combined with the power of a story that has been reinforced over generations. When you grow up hearing about the woman in white who walks the riverbanks, you are more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as matching that pattern. This is probably true in many cases. The human mind is remarkably good at finding what it expects to find, and a legend as culturally saturated as La Llorona creates a template that distorts perception in its own direction. And yet, the believers point to the consistency of the accounts, the fact that people from very different backgrounds, in locations hundreds of miles apart, describe essentially the same experience without having coordinated their stories. They point to the emotional intensity of the witnesses, the way that even skeptics who encounter something near the water come away shaken, convinced that whatever they saw or heard was not normal. They point to the sheer persistence of the phenomenon, the way that sightings continue year after year, century after century, as if something real is generating the reports, even if we cannot explain what that something might be. Whether La Llorona exists as an independent supernatural entity, or whether she exists only as a cultural construct maintained by belief and reinforced by ambiguous experience, may be impossible to determine. But in either case, she remains present in the minds and lives of millions of people across the Americas, as real in her effects as any ghost could be. She has been on screen almost as long as movies themselves. The first known film adaptation of the La Llorona legend appeared in Mexico in 1933, just 6 years after the first talking pictures revolutionized the industry. It was followed by another version in 1960, then a steady stream of productions across the decades: animated films for children, horror movies for adults, television episodes, direct-to-video releases, and prestige productions that won awards at international festivals. By the 21st century, La Llorona had become one of the most filmed ghost stories in Latin American cinema, a figure as recognizable to Mexican audiences as Dracula or Frankenstein is to American viewers. The story proved infinitely adaptable, capable of being told as tragedy or horror or cautionary morality tale, set in the colonial past or the present day, played straight or subverted in ways that commented on the original legend. In 2019, 2 very different films brought La Llorona to global attention. The first was The Curse of La Llorona, an American production from Warner Brothers that was marketed as part of the Conjuring horror franchise. Directed by Michael Chavez and produced by James Wan, the film starred Linda Cardellini as a Los Angeles social worker in 1973 who must protect her children from a supernatural threat. With a modest production budget of $9 million, the film grossed over $120 million worldwide, proving that La Llorona had commercial appeal far beyond her traditional territory. But the film also generated controversy, particularly among Latino audiences who had hoped for a more faithful and culturally grounded adaptation. Critics pointed out that the lead was played by a white actress whose character had minimal connection to Mexican culture, that the film reduced the complex legend to a generic haunted house formula, and that the rich history of La Llorona, from the Aztec origins to the colonial trauma to the feminist reinterpretations, was stripped away in favor of jump scares and predictable horror beats. The second 2019 film told a very different story. Jairo Bustamante's La Llorona, produced in Guatemala with support from France, took the legend and wove it through the history of the Guatemalan Civil War and the genocide of Maya Ixil people that the Guatemalan government perpetrated in the 1980s. In Bustamante's film, La Llorona becomes a vengeful ghost who haunts an elderly general after he is acquitted of war crimes on a technicality. She represents not just a mother mourning her children, but all the indigenous mothers who lost their families to state-sponsored violence, the victims who cry out for justice, even when the courts have failed them. The film received widespread critical acclaim, appearing on year-end best-of lists and winning awards at festivals around the world. Where the Hollywood version had stripped La Llorona of her cultural context, the Guatemalan version deepened it, showing how the legend could be reimagined to address contemporary injustice while remaining true to its core themes of grief, guilt, and the impossibility of escaping the consequences of violence against the innocent. These 2 films represent a tension that runs through all cultural productions involving La Llorona. Who owns this story and who has the right to tell it? The legend began as an indigenous belief tied to specific goddesses and specific cultural practices. It evolved through centuries of colonization, absorbing European influences while retaining its Mesoamerican core. Today, it belongs to communities across Latin America and the American Southwest, people who grew up hearing about her from their grandmothers, people who still glance nervously toward the water on certain nights, people for whom La Llorona is not just entertainment, but part of their cultural inheritance. When Hollywood takes that inheritance and transforms it into a generic ghost story for global audiences, something is lost. When filmmakers from within the tradition use the legend to explore their own community's trauma and history, something is found. The conversation continues with every new adaptation, every new interpretation, every argument about what La Llorona means and who gets to define it. Beyond film, La Llorona pervades popular culture in ways both solemn and commercial. Every autumn, Mexico City hosts a theatrical performance of the legend on the canals of Xochimilco, La Chihuahuatle, Leyenda de la Llorona, an event that has been running since 1993 and draws tens of thousands of spectators each season. Audience members ride the colorful Trajinera boats through the waterways at night, watching actors perform scenes from the legend on floating stages and along the shore, the performance culminating in her appearance amid fog and wailing that echoes across the water. In music, the traditional folk song La Llorona has been covered by generations of Mexican artists, but no interpretation has resonated quite like that of Chavela Vargas, whose gravelly voice brought new depth to the ancient lament. Born in Costa Rica in 1919, but adopted by Mexico as one of its greatest ranchera singers, Chavela Vargas lived a life as dramatic as any legend. She drank heavily, loved openly, and refused to hide who she was, in an era when women were expected to be demure and men controlled the music industry. She was a close friend of Frida Kahlo, living for a time in the famous Blue House in Coyoacán, and many believe theirs was more than friendship. When asked about it late in life, Chavela simply smiled and said some things were better left as mystery. Her career collapsed in the 1970s as alcoholism took its toll, and she disappeared from public life for nearly 15 years. When she returned in 1991, clean and sober and in her 70s, her voice had become something extraordinary, rougher, deeper, carrying the weight of decades of living and loss. And the song she became most associated with in this final chapter of her career was La Llorona. When Chavela sang La Llorona, the song became something confessional. The traditional lyrics speak of passing by a church, of seeing the woman who has made you cry, of a love so consuming it destroys. In Chavela's voice, these words stopped being about a ghost and started being about grief itself, about the way loss reshapes us, about the things we carry that we can never put down. She sang it as though she were La Llorona, as though she had lived the legend's grief and emerged to testify. She continued performing until her death in 2012 at the age of 93, and La Llorona remained in her repertoire until the end. When Pixar included a version of the song in their 2017 film Coco, millions of children around the world heard La Llorona for the first time, the legend sneaking into their consciousness through animation and music. Chavela's interpretation, sampled and covered and referenced across genres, ensured that the weeping woman would continue to find new audiences long after the singer herself had joined the ancestors. She appears in literature and video games, in Halloween attractions and theme park rides, in artwork and academic papers, and countless conversations among people who remember being warned about her as children. Universal Studios has featured La Llorona at their Halloween Horror Nights events, transforming the legend into an immersive haunted house experience. Artists like Alejandro Colunga have created visual interpretations that hang in museums. Chicana writers and scholars have claimed her as a figure of resistance and female power, reinterpreting her story to challenge patriarchal narratives rather than reinforce them. Each new interpretation adds another layer to a legend that has been accumulating layers for 5 centuries. The Aztec Omen, the colonial ghost story, the cautionary tale, the feminist symbol, the horror movie monster, the cultural heritage worth protecting. La Llorona contains all of these and more. What remains constant is the cry. No matter how the story is told, no matter who tells it, or what medium they use, or what message they intend to convey, there is always that sound at the center. A woman weeping for her lost children, a grief so profound it has survived centuries, a voice that carries across water and through darkness to reach the ears of anyone willing to listen. Ay, mis hijos. The words have not changed. The pain has not diminished. And as long as people continue to hear them in stories, in songs, in the wind moving through trees near a river, La Llorona will continue to exist, as real in her way as any figure from history. She is still out there. On nights when the air grows still and the water reflects the stars like scattered jewels, when the hour grows late and respectable people are safe inside their homes, she walks. She has been walking for 500 years, or perhaps much longer than that, since long before anyone wrote down her story or gave her a name that people would remember. The rivers remember her. The canals and acequias know the sound of her footsteps, the rustle of her white dress against the reeds. The children who are warned not to wander near the water after dark carry her with them into adulthood, and when they become parents themselves, they repeat the warning to another generation, passing the ghost from grandmother to grandchild in an unbroken chain of fear and caution and love. What does it mean that the same ghost walks in so many places? Before she was Maria at the riverbank, she was Chihuacoatl wailing through the streets of Tenochtitlan. Before she was a warning about dangerous water, she was a goddess who knew that motherhood was a battlefield where women could die as surely as any warrior. She has worn many faces across 5 centuries: the skull-faced goddess, the betrayed translator, the drowned woman in white, but beneath all of them is the same truth. Some losses are too vast to carry alone. The weeping mother appears wherever children are vulnerable and grief runs deep. She appears because water is dangerous, because colonization created wounds that still bleed, because women have been expected to sacrifice everything and then punished for breaking under the weight, because every parent knows the terror of losing a child, and every child knows the fear of wandering too far from home. But she is also something more specific than an archetype. She belongs to the people who have been telling her story for 5 centuries, the communities along the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe River and the canals of Phoenix and the waterways of Guatemala, where her cries are still occasionally heard. She is passed down by grandmothers who learned the story from their grandmothers, women who may never write books or make films, but who preserve the legend in its most authentic form, adapted to local geography and local concerns, alive in a way that no museum exhibit or Hollywood production can quite capture. She is a cultural inheritance, and like all cultural inheritances, she is contested and evolving and fiercely loved by those who understand what she truly means. Tonight, somewhere, a mother is telling her children about La Llorona. She is describing the white dress and the weeping, the riverbank where the ghost appears, the cry that sounds far away when she is close and close when she is far. She is weaving a story that is part warning and part entertainment and part connection to a heritage that spans continents and centuries. And the children are listening with wide eyes, half terrified and half thrilled, absorbing a legend that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. Tomorrow, those children will remember to stay away from the water after dark. They will glance over their shoulders when they cross a bridge at night. They will carry La Llorona with them into adulthood, and someday, they will tell the same story to their own children. The cry continues. Ay, mis hijos. She is still searching. She will always be searching. And as long as there are rivers to haunt, and children to protect, and stories to tell in the darkness, she will keep walking, dressed in white, weeping for what was lost. A ghost who has outlived empires and will outlive us all. Listen carefully when you are near the water tonight. You might hear her.